Over the past year, there's been one thing that's really been bothering me about my workshop, and it's this workbench. And to call it a workbench is really a stretch. It's really just a piece of melamine on a couple of boards that are all on top of these homemade sawhorses. But the worst part of the whole thing is, anytime I need to cut a wide longboard like this one, this happens. Which makes it pretty inconvenient anytime I want to try to use the table saw, but luckily, I have a plan to fix it.
And that plan starts with what all workbenches need, a bunch of wood. And no, not these random pieces of cedar. I'm making this bench out of MDF, which is great for a bench because it's heavy and it's stable. But the problem with using MDF is it sags if left unsupported, which is why this bench top is going to be a torsion box. And I'll explain what that is in a second, but first a tip. Anytime you measure a board, make sure your tape is parallel with the side. Otherwise, it won't be very accurate. And now it's time I break these sheets down, but before I do, safety first. With all those parts roughed out, I'm going to set up the miter station to cut them all to a consistent length. And if you're wondering why this board I'm about to cut is pine and not MDF, well, I'll explain that in a little bit. But first, I want to talk a little bit about torsion boxes. The torsion box is two sheet goods sandwiching a lattice structure. And that structure and the sheets combine with a bunch of glue and some nails to make a very rigid, stable, and most importantly, flat surface. And if you're skeptical, well, this is exactly how the interior doors of your home were made, just with, some thinner parts than 3/4 inch MDF. And the reason why I selected this style of bench top isn't because it's better than a traditional heavy hardwood bench, but because it's easier and faster to make while achieving a way flatter surface than I had before. But is it better? Well, not necessarily. If I had the time and money, I would have made a traditional joiner's bench, but for now, you know what? This will do just fine. But on to assembly, where this pine board is re-entering because MDF is terrible at holding screws. So I'm gluing this board to the inside of the MDF so I have a place to sink screws into for future mounting locations. As for the rest of the assembly, well, the lattice structure is pretty easy to make. Just offset those inner supports so you can get the nail gun in there to do its job. And these nails, they're really just clamps to keep the parts in place. The glue is doing the heavy lifting here. And the trick to achieving a nice and flat torsion box is to assemble this lattice in a flat location, but my garage floor is not flat, so that's why I put some spacers and shimmed everything before I began. But for now, while this lattice dries, I'm going to head over to where the new bench will be and make some space. Now, I've already addressed how this bench is going to be flatter than my old one, but not how I'm going to solve the problem of having this bench in the way of the table saw. One solution would be to make a short bench, but I'm not particularly short, and as I get older, I don't like bending over to work. So I need an idea to make a modular height workbench, which is why I was delighted when FlexiSpot reached out to sponsor this video. And they sent me their E7 Plus 4-legged standing desk base. This base comes with some really simple, easy to follow instructions, and it was a breeze to put together. This model can hold 550 pounds and lift 440 and has 4 customizable memory presets so you can set the lifting motion to automatically go up and down into position for things like planing, sawing, sanding, and of course all the way down below the table saw. But one thing I was skeptical of is if this desk base would be able to handle the abuse of a workshop, which is why I devised a few tests. But before we get to the tests, I'm going to add a little extra wood for a surprise addition to the bench before I put the top on and lock this all in place. Now, I didn't show the bottom assembly, but it's identical to this process that I'm going to do on the top, and it's pretty complicated, so I slowed the footage down so you can follow along. The first step is to spread glue on all of the lattice ribs, and the second is to plop the top on. The third is to mark where those lattices were, and the last step is to use my body weight to hold the top down while I nail it in place. And with the top on, you can see that the edges are slightly overhanging, which I will trim with the most annoying sound in the world. Okay, that's quite enough of that. Let's go ahead and get on to the testing.
So before I add the final details, I want to run a couple of tests on this to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to.
The first test is to see if the bench will move up, and the second is to see if it'll go down.
So now that we know it can go up and down, the next test is to see how much can it really lift. I know it's rated for 440 pounds, and this top itself is probably around 140. You add meat to that, that's pushing 300, and that's not even close to its max capacity. But what I want to see is when I get a bunch of lumber on here, will it still work? So now if I hop on, we've got to be stretching its limits. Oh, it's not happy, but we're lifting. Well, I think we were maxing this thing out. I don't know how much all this stuff weighs, but I'll go ahead and do the math and I'll put it up on screen. For now, let's go ahead and move on to the third and final test. But if you're curious what I'm using all of this white oak for, well, you might as well subscribe and then you can see in my next video. So the third and final test is to see, will this thing stay put when I use a hand plane? So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the ground with a little bit of tape. So this tape here is going to show me exactly where the bench is. So after I plane, if it moves forward and crosses this line, then I know that I need to add a little bit more weight or potentially even bolt it down to the ground. So with the plane test, I noticed a little bit of wobble up top and I can even move it right now. But that's not a big deal because the base didn't move at all, which means this thing's heavy enough and stable enough to stay put as I'm using it to plane, and I'll just fix it later. That'll be a future video. But before I can get to the rest of the bench, I do need to address something down here. So my old workbench with those sawhorses had little shelves that I used to put stuff on. And eventually I'm going to put something in here that's going to give it a little bit more of a solid foundation. But for now, I don't want to do anything that's going to get in the way of this movement of the sit-stand desk. And I also don't want to get rid of any storage space because, face it, I'm in a little garage. I don't have a lot of it. So FlexiSpot was kind enough to set me up with a garage storage rack, which I'll install now.
So I'm lucky, and my garage has really tall ceilings, which makes it a perfect spot to add this FlexiSpot storage rack. And it's really easy to install. They send everything, including some really detailed instructions, which makes it a breeze. Now this storage rack is an 8-foot model, but I decided it was a little bit too big for my space here and went with 2 racks to make it a 4-foot by 4-foot unit, which is really easy to do with its modular design for putting it together. And if you're worried about installing these on the ceiling and getting this heavy rack up over your head, well, FlexiSpot thought of that and they put these little clips that'll hold it in place. But I ran into a little problem since I set the arms as high as they would go, which put the bolts in the way of the rack. But that's nothing a little persuasion can't fix. This storage rack is a great addition to the garage and will keep my wife happy by moving all of her precious, fragile collectibles up off the floor and well out of harm's way. Now it's time to head back to the bench for the final surprise, a vise, which really isn't that surprising given this is a workbench, but anyway. For the vise, I need some hardwood, which I'm cutting at the miter saw and showing why it's important to take shallow passes when cutting a bowed board. You can see with every pass how the board relaxes until it finally drops down to the table. By taking shallow passes, you're reducing the likelihood this board will pinch the blade and bind or kick back at you. And if you found that tip or any of the tips in this video helpful, leave me a comment down below and let me know. I'm never sure if any of the information I'm sharing is new or if it's all old and boring and unoriginal. And if that's the case, then I'll come up with some more exciting facts to share, like how crocodiles can gallop like a horse. And if you don't believe me, well, wait until the end of the video and I'll share something that proves it. Anyways, this skirt board is installed slightly higher than the workbench, and I did that on purpose so I could bring it into perfect alignment with the hand plane. With the solid surface ready to receive the vise, I have one more piece of woodworking left to do before I can wrap this one up. And that's to add a bevel to the vise plate, which will allow for the plate to bend as the vise tightens. Typically, this motion would cause the jaws to open slightly at the top, but the bevel will compensate to keep the upper end closed and maximum holding power intact. But let me tell you, hand planing in 102-degree weather is not fun. Luckily, I have some power tools that will save me some sweat. I set up this sled with a shim on one side, which when run through the planer will cut the bevel for me. And with that, it's a simple matter of taking the vise out of my old bench and putting it in the new one. And while I do that, I want to take this opportunity to thank FlexiSpot for sponsoring this video. If you're interested in an E7 Plus 4-legged standing desk or a garage storage rack, they have a sale going on right now, and you can get there through the links down in the description of this video. And if you're in the market for a new desk or a workbench, well, I have to say, FlexiSpot's hardware really impressed me. Between the load that it can lift and the stability that I saw in the testing, this bench has quickly become my favorite piece of shop equipment. And that's it. This bench is adjustable. It has custom presets for things like planing, or it can lift a little bit higher for when I want to handsaw. And of course, all the way down and moved out of the way anytime I need to use the table saw. It's simple, it's flat, and most importantly, it's ready for my next project.